When my husband tucked a sealed, heavy pouch into my carry-on before our flight, he thought he was buying his freedom with my life. I'm Mira, 52, a veteran escrow officer from Cleveland. He forgot my job is finding hidden liabilities and redirecting them. If you've ever sat at a worn kitchen table, holding a mug of lukewarm tea while the man you built a life with looks right through you as if you're a piece of old drywall, then you know the cold that settles in your bones. It's not a crying cold. It's a quiet, clear-headed freeze. I know some of you are sitting under that same dim light right now, wondering when the partner who promised to cherish you started treating you like an obstacle to be cleared. I want you to take a deep breath. Stay with me. Do not scream, and do not cry. When they decide you are disposable, they have already handed you the scissors to cut their strings. For 26 years, I was the steady ground beneath Julian's feet. I am an escrow compliance officer at Buckeye State Title. If you don't know what that means, it means my entire professional life is spent reading the fine print. I look at deeds, tax liens, corporate filings, and closing disclosures. I find the things people try to bury in the margins of 60-page contracts. It's quiet, meticulous work, and it paid for the roof over our heads during the 15 years it took Julian to build his boutique commercial real estate brokerage. I packed his lunches in recycled plastic containers while he leased his first luxury sedan. I mended the cuffs of his shirts with a silver needle my grandmother gave me, saving every penny so he could present himself to the Cleveland elite as a man of substance. And for a long time, I thought we were a team. Then came Janelle. She is 27. Hired as his executive administrative liaison, a title Julian created to justify her salary, which was nearly double what a standard secretary in Northern Ohio makes. Janelle has the kind of youth that hasn't had to work 80-hour weeks to pay off a mortgage. She wears pastel designer suits that look like they belong in a Chicago high-rise, and she has a way of looking at my sensible orthopedic loafers with a soft, patronizing pity. "Oh, Myra," she'd say, her voice dripping with artificial sweetener whenever she stopped by our house to drop off documents Julian supposedly forgot. "You still cook from scratch. How sweet. I just don't know how you find the energy at your stage of life." Julian would smile, his eyes lingering on her manicured hands, while I stood there in my kitchen with a flour-dusted dish towel, feeling like a relic from a museum he was eager to close. The betrayal didn't start with a hotel receipt or a stray scent of expensive jasmine perfume, though those came later. It started with the paperwork. In my line of work, you learn that people don't just change their lives overnight, they prepare the financial soil first. Over the last 6 months, I noticed Julian's brokerage accounts began showing unusual patterns. Since I had helped him set up his corporate structure years ago, my name remained as a secondary guarantor on his firm's escrow compliance bond. It was a detail he'd clearly forgotten. Or perhaps he assumed a 52-year-old wife who spent her weekends baking zucchini bread wouldn't think to audit her own husband's professional ledger, but I did. I saw the slow, steady drain of capital from his firm's operational reserve into an offshore entity registered in the Cayman Islands under the name J&J Horizon Holdings. J&J. Julian and Janelle. It wasn't hard to do the math. The real blow, the one that knocked the wind out of me and left me clutching the edge of our laminate kitchen counter, was the realization of what he planned to do to my reputation. Julian's firm had been handling the escrow funds for a major retail development on the west side of Cleveland, nearly $4 million in earnest money deposits. If those funds went missing, the state licensing board wouldn't just shut him down. They would look at the compliance officer whose signature was on the quarterly audits. My signature. He had been forging my name on the compliance verifications for 3 quarters, transferring the liability of the missing millions directly onto my shoulders. He was setting me up to take the fall for a massive financial fraud, ensuring that while he and Janelle slipped away to a country without an extradition treaty, I would be left standing in a federal courtroom, trying to explain why my handwriting was on the documents that ruined dozens of local small business investors. My sister, Claire, who works as a cataloger at the public library and has the fierce protective heart of a lioness, was the only one I told. She sat with me on my back porch, the hum of the cicadas heavy in the humid Ohio air, and cried for me. "He's going to destroy you, Mira," she whispered, her fingers tight around my wrist. "He's going to put you in a cage and walk away with your life in his pockets." "No," I told her, looking out at the tomato plants I had carefully staked in the backyard. "He is going to try." The opportunity they chose was the annual International Real Estate Summit in Zurich, Switzerland. Julian insisted I come along. "A second honeymoon, sweetie," he'd said, his voice smooth, his hand resting on my shoulder with a warmth that felt like dry ice. "We'll fly out of Cleveland Hopkins, lay over in Newark, and then straight to Zurich. Janelle is coming too, of course, just to handle the foreign exchange paperwork and the conference scheduling. But you and I will have the evenings." I knew why he wanted me on that flight. Under federal banking laws, if a suspect in an active escrow fraud investigation flees the country, their assets are frozen immediately. But if the primary suspect, the compliance officer, is detained at international customs with incriminating evidence on her person, the secondary partner has a window of 48 hours before the full audit is triggered. It was a clean, brutal timeline. I was to be the sacrificial lamb at the border, buying him and Janelle the time they needed to transfer the remaining $4 million out of the escrow accounts and disappear. The night before our flight, the house was dead silent except for the low rumble of the central air conditioning. Julian thought I was asleep. I had taken 2 melatonin tablets and made a show of turning off my bedside lamp at 9 o'clock. But I was awake, sitting in the dark of the guest bedroom, listening. At midnight, I heard the soft creak of the floorboards in the hallway. I crept to the door and cracked it open just a sliver. Julian was in the laundry room, where our suitcases were laid out. The light from the single overhead bulb caught the silver of his hair and the sharp, anxious line of his jaw. He was holding my favorite canvas suitcase, the sturdy, forest green bag I had purchased with my very first bonus check 30 years ago. From inside his leather briefcase, he pulled out a thick, heavy, vacuum-sealed black plastic pouch. It was about the size of a paperback novel, wrapped tightly in silver lead foil tape, the kind designed to shield contents from standard X-ray machines. Which, irony of ironies, actually makes them stand out like a beacon to high-definition airport security scanners because it blocks the light. With a small utility knife, Julian carefully sliced open the inner fabric lining of my suitcase, right along the seam of the plastic support board. He slid the heavy silver-wrapped package inside, smoothing the fabric back down. Then, using a small hot glue gun he had taken from my own sewing basket, he meticulously resealed the seam. He stood back, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead, a thin, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He had no idea that I was watching him through the gap in the door, my hand pressed hard against my mouth to keep from breathing too loud. He wasn't just leaving me, he was burying me. Inside that package, as I would later confirm when he went downstairs to get a glass of water, were 2 things: a stack of unregistered, bearer bonds stolen from his clients' trust accounts, and a dense, plastic-wrapped block of high-grade prescription narcotics he must have sourced through one of his shady commercial tenants. It was a package designed to guarantee an immediate non-bailable arrest by federal customs agents the moment my bag passed through the security checkpoint. I stood there in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. For a second, the sheer weight of his cruelty threatened to crush me. 26 years of marriage. 26 years of packing his lunches, supporting his dreams, and forgiving his coldness. And this was my reward. A one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary while he drank champagne in the Swiss Alps with a woman young enough to be his daughter. But then, the panic cleared. The training took over. When you spend 30 years looking at fraudulent contracts, you learn that the person who signs the document isn't always the one who pays the price. The key to resolving a bad transaction is redirection. You don't try to stop the train, you just switch the tracks. I waited until I heard the heavy, rhythmic sound of Julian's snoring from our master bedroom. Then, I slipped out of bed, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floors, and walked down the hall to where the luggage stood waiting like silent accomplices in the dark. Kneeling on the cold hardwood floor of the guest bedroom, I could still smell the chemical temps of the hot glue Julian had used. It hung in the drafty air of the hallway, a lingering scent of his desperation. My hands, normally so steady when I was sorting through hundreds of pages of title deeds, shook just a little as I reached into my sewing basket. I didn't grab the heavy shears. I grabbed my mother's old seam ripper, tiny, bone-handled tool with a small red ball on the fork, designed to slide under the tightest threads without tearing the surrounding fabric. You learn a lot about a person's hands when you've been married to them for 26 years. I knew the exact pressure Julian applied when he was trying to hide something. He was impatient. He was a man of big gestures, not fine details. When he glued the lining of my forest green canvas suitcase back down, he'd used too much adhesive, leaving a hard, bumpy ridge along the seam of the plastic support board. I slid the seam ripper under the warm, rubbery glue. With a soft, rhythmic asterisk pop, dash pop, dash pop, asterisk, the threads gave way. I peeled back the fabric. There it was. The heavy vacuum-sealed black pouch, wrapped in that thick, light-blocking silver lead foil tape. Up close, it felt incredibly heavy, almost like a lead fishing weight. It was a physical manifestation of his betrayal. He hadn't just slipped a lie into my life. He had planted a 3-pound anchor designed to drag me to the bottom of the lake. I didn't panic. I didn't cry. If you've ever had to correct a major title defect on a property 3 hours before closing, while the buyers are waiting in the lobby with their moving truck idling outside, you know that panic is a luxury you cannot afford. You just look at the error, you find the remedy, and you execute. I pulled the package out. My suitcase lining was slightly frayed, but I had prepared for this. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small tube of professional-grade fabric cement, the kind I used to mend the hems of Julian's trousers when he was too cheap to pay a tailor. I applied a thin, even bead of the liquid along the seam, pressed the green fabric back into place, and smoothed it down with the back of a silver spoon. Within 3 minutes, the bond was dry and completely flat. To anyone looking, it was just the inner lining of an old, well-traveled bag. Now, I had the package, and I knew exactly where it needed to go. Janelle's luggage was sitting in our mudroom, right by the door that led to the garage. Julian had insisted on picking her up from her apartment the evening before, claiming it was operational efficiency for our early morning departure. "She's staying at the airport Marriott tonight, Mira," he'd told me, not looking me in the eye as he poured himself a glass of scotch. "But she wanted to drop her main bag here so we don't have to fiddle with her heavy luggage in the shuttle line tomorrow. It's just easier if I pack the SUV tonight." It was a beautiful lie, wrapped in the language of convenience. In reality, he wanted to make sure all the pieces of his trap were in play before we even left the driveway. I carried the heavy package down the stairs, my bare feet silent on the carpeted treads. The house was cold. We kept the thermostat at 64 in the winter to save on the heating bill, another one of my compromises, while Julian leased his foreign cars. Janelle's suitcase was hard to miss. It was a hard-shell spinner in a shade of pastel pink that she probably called blush, but to me, it looked like cheap bubblegum. It was pristine, without a single scuff mark from a baggage carousel. I knelt beside it. Most modern suitcases have a zipper at the very bottom of the interior lining, running right down the middle between the metal tracks of the telescoping handle. Manufacturers put it there for repairs, which is why they purposefully install the zipper slider backward, without a pull tab, so travelers won't mess with it. But as an escrow officer, I know that what is hidden is always meant to be accessed by those who know where to look. I fished a small metal paperclip from my pocket, straightened the end, and slid it through the tiny eyelet of the backward zipper. With a gentle pull, the zipper slid open smoothly. I took the lead-wrapped package. I slid it deep into the hollow space between the outer plastic shell and the aluminum handle tubes, pushing it down until it wedged tightly against the bottom wheels. It was a perfect fit. I zipped the lining back up, hid the paperclip back in my pocket, and stood up. Redirection. The first rule of a clean escrow. You don't stop the funds, you just change the routing number. I know some of you might be shaking your heads right now, thinking I was being cruel. You might think, Mira, she's just a young girl who got caught up with a sweet-talking older man. But let me tell you something about Janelle. 2 months ago, she came to our office under the pretense of delivering Julian's signature pages. She stood by my desk, looking at my worn, wooden nameplate, the one my father carved for me when I passed my certification exam. "It must be so comforting," Janelle had said, her voice soft and sharp as a razor blade, "to have a job where nothing ever changes. Where you just stay in the same little room, day after day, while the rest of the world moves on. Julian says you're like the drywall in the house, Mira. Essential, but nobody really looks at you." I hadn't answered her then. I had just smiled and filed the paperwork. But as I stood in my dark mudroom, looking down at her pink suitcase, I whispered to the quiet house, "Drywall holds up the roof, Janelle, and when you try to tear it down, the ceiling comes with it." I went back up the stairs, but not to bed. I went to our small home office. The desk was a simple pine table I'd bought at a garage sale 30 years ago. On it sat my work laptop. Buckeye State Title has strict security protocols, but as the senior compliance officer, I had a master secure token key on a small brass ring. I plugged it into the USB port. For the next 3 hours, while the digital clock on the wall ticked toward 3 a.m., I worked. I didn't look at social media. I didn't look at photos of our vacations. I looked at the numbers. I downloaded the digital audit trail for the Westside Retail Development escrow account. I pulled up the quarterly compliance verifications for the last 9 months. There they were, my signatures, neat and precise, authorizing the release of funds to J&J Horizon Holdings. But Julian had made a fatal mistake. He was an amateur in a world of professionals. He had used a digital image of my signature that he'd scanned from our joint tax return 3 years ago. But on my professional escrow documents, I always sign with a tiny, deliberate dot inside the loop of the Y in Myra security measure. I'd adopted decades ago after a local builder tried to forge my name on a construction draw. None of the signatures on Julian's compliance forms had that dot. I took high-resolution screenshots of the comparison. I pulled the incorporation documents for J&J Horizon Holdings from the Ohio Secretary of State's database, showing Julian and Janelle as the sole managing members. I pulled the bank routing numbers showing the transfer of $4.2 million from the local escrow account to the private offshore account in Zurich. I copied everything, every ledger, every forged document, every bank statement onto a small, key-shaped brass USB drive. Then, I wrote a letter. It wasn't an emotional letter. It didn't mention 26 years of marriage, or the lunches I'd packed, or the coldness in his eyes. It was written in the dry, precise language of a regulatory audit. I detailed the exact dates, the exact transaction numbers, and the specific state statutes Julian had violated. I addressed it to the Ohio Department of Insurance's Fraud Division and the IE Financial Crimes Unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation on Lakeside Avenue in Cleveland. I printed 2 physical copies on our quiet home laser printer. The paper slid out of the machine, warm and smelling of toner. I placed the documents and the brass USB drive into a heavy manila folder with a metal clasp. At 4:30 a.m., a soft pair of headlights swept across the living room window. It was Claire. She parked her old station wagon at the end of the driveway, keeping the engine running so she wouldn't wake Julian. She let herself in through the kitchen door, her face pale in the dim light of the stove hood. She was wearing her thick, green knitted cardigan, the one with the frayed elbows, and she looked like she hadn't slept a wink. She didn't say a word. She just reached out and pulled me into a tight, hard hug. I could feel her shaking. "You don't have to do this, Mira," she whispered into my hair. "We can just call the police right now. We can tell them what he did. If I call them now, Claire, he'll hire a team of expensive lawyers and claim it was an administrative error." I said, my voice steady, though my heart was aching for the sister who was carrying my burden with me. "He'll say I did it because I was a bitter wife. But if the evidence is delivered while he is trying to cross an international border with the assets in tow, there is no lawyer in Ohio who can save him." I handed her the heavy manila folder. "At 9 a.m., our flight board's in Newark," I said. "I want you to walk this folder directly into the FBI office downtown. Ask for Special Agent Vance. I've already sent a preliminary encrypted email to his secure address, so he'll be waiting for you." Claire looked down at the folder as if it were made of glass. "And what about you? What if something goes wrong at the security gate in Cleveland?" "Nothing will go wrong for me," I said, placing my hand over hers. "I am just a quiet woman taking a trip with her husband." She looked at me, her eyes filling with tears. "He really thought you were stupid, didn't he?" "No," I said, looking toward the dark hallway where Julian lay sleeping. "He just thought I was invisible. And in my world, being invisible is the greatest advantage you can have." By 5:30 in the morning, our house was alive with the restless, electric energy of a man who believed he was about to outrun his past. I sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in my faded blue fleece robe, holding a mug of black coffee. I didn't add sugar. I wanted to taste the bitterness. I wanted it to keep me sharp. Through the kitchen archway, I watched Julian. He was already dressed in his travel uniform, a crisp charcoal gray merino wool quarter-zip, tailored trousers, and those Italian leather loafers that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. He was humming a little tune under his breath, a jaunty rhythmic sound that made my skin crawl. He walked into the mudroom where the luggage stood. I didn't move, but I stopped breathing. I watched him through the reflection in the dark kitchen window. Julian approached my forest green canvas suitcase. He reached down and lifted it by the top handle. I saw his shoulders tense slightly as he gauged the weight. He expected it to be heavy, anchored by the 3-pound package of bearer bonds and narcotics he had sewn into the lining. It was heavy, but it wasn't heavy with his trap. Before I went to sleep, I had slipped too thick. discarded library books into the bottom compartment of my bag *, the history of Cuyahoga County *, and a bound volume of * Ohio municipal zoning regulations *. They were dense, heavy, and completely legal. Julian let out a short, satisfied breath and set the bag back down. He didn't unzip it. Why would he? He had sealed the trap himself. He had no reason to believe his quiet, predictable wife had spent the night dissecting his work with a seam ripper and a paperclip. "Morning, sweetheart," he said, stepping into the kitchen and planting a dry, fleeting kiss on the top of my head. He smelled of expensive mint mouthwash and sandalwood cologne. "You're up early. Excited for Switzerland?" "I couldn't sleep," I said, my voice matching the low, flat tone I used when delivering bad news about a title lien. "There's a lot on my mind." "Just leave all the stress here in Cleveland," he said, patting my shoulder with a patronizing warmth that made me feel physically ill. "This trip is about fresh starts. We're going to turn a corner, Mira, I promise you." Oh, we are turning a corner. Julian, I thought, looking at the tiny chip on the rim of my coffee mug. But you have no idea who is driving the car. If you've ever had to look into the eyes of someone who is actively planning your ruins, someone who has shared your bed, your bank accounts, and your youth and smile back at them, then you know the sheer, exhausting effort of keeping your face still. It takes every ounce of your soul to keep from screaming the truth in their face. But I know some of you reading this have had to do exactly that. You've had to play the fool to catch the thief. You've had to let them think they are the smartest person in the room, just long enough for them to walk right into the trap they built for you. Stay steady. The quietest water runs the deepest. By 6:15, we were in Julian's luxury SUV, driving south on Interstate 71 toward Cleveland Hopkins International Airport. The morning was typical for Northeast Ohio in early spring, a heavy, slate-gray fog hanging over the highway, the asphalt salt-stained and cracked from the winter freeze. The wipers made a rhythmic, rubbery click against the windshield. Julian's phone was mounted on the dashboard. Every few minutes it would light up with a notification. He kept his eyes on the road, but I saw the muscles in his jaw clench every time the screen flickered. He was waiting for confirmation. In my line of work, we call this the escrow holding period, the agonizing window of time between the wire transfer being initiated and the funds actually clearing the receiving bank. He had already initiated the transfer of the $4 million from the West Side Retail Development escrow account. Now, he was just waiting for the Swiss accounts to show the active balance. "Did you double-check your ID, Myra?" he asked, his voice a little too tight, his fingers tapping a nervous beat on the leather-wrapped steering wheel. "Your passport. You have it in your purse." "Right here," I said, touching the zipper of my sensible microfiber handbag. "Under my reading glasses." Good. Security can be a real headache these days. We want to make sure we have everything in order. "No delays, of course," I said. "We wouldn't want any unexpected complications." He glanced at me, his eyes scanning my face for a split second, looking for any sign of suspicion. But 30 years of working with frantic buyers, dishonest sellers, and shady developers had given me a face like granite. I looked exactly like what he wanted me to be. A tired, middle-aged wife who was just trying to survive a long-haul flight in economy class. We pulled into the airport's departing flights lane. The terminal was bustling with early morning travelers, businessmen in dark suits, families dragging oversized suitcases, and airport employees in high-visibility vests. And there, standing by the sliding glass doors of the United Airlines entrance, was Janelle. She looked like she had stepped out of a luxury travel magazine. She was wearing a cream-colored cashmere trench coat, oversized designer sunglasses, despite the overcast Cleveland sky, and white leather ankle boots. Beside her stood her hardshell, bubblegum pink spinner suitcase. It looked incredibly bright against the gray concrete of the terminal sidewalk. Julian's face lit up the moment he saw her. The nervous tension in his shoulders vanished, replaced by a smooth, confident swagger. He parked the SUV in the active drop-off zone, killed the engine, and practically jumped out of the car to greet her. "Janelle, that's excellent timing," he said, his voice booming with professional enthusiasm as he pulled her pink suitcase from the curb and loaded it into the back of our vehicle alongside our bags. "Good morning, Julian," she purred, sliding her sunglasses down her nose to look at him over the rims. Then, her eyes drifted to the passenger side where I was stepping out of the car. Her smile turned tight, professional, and dripping with artificial pity. "And good morning to you, Mira. I hope the early drive wasn't too hard on you. I know how difficult mornings can be at your stage of life." I managed, Janelle, I said, adjusting the strap of my purse. I've been waking up early since before you were in kindergarten. She let out a soft, condescending chuckle and turned back to Julian, ignoring me completely. I've already checked our flight status on the app. We're on time, but the TSA lines are looking quite long. We should probably get moving. Absolutely, Julian said. He grabbed his sleek black Tumi bag and my forest green canvas suitcase. He handed the pink spinner back to Janelle, his fingers lingering on hers for a fraction of a second too long. Janelle, you take your bag. Mira, you carry your purse. I'll handle the heavy lifting. He was so eager. He wanted to make sure my green suitcase, the one he believed was packed with federal prison time, was right there, easily accessible, ready to be placed on the security conveyor belt under my name. We walked into the terminal. The air inside was warm, smelling of stale coffee, jet fuel, and the chemical floor wax used in high-traffic public spaces. The high ceiling echoed with the constant hum of announcements and the rolling clatter of thousands of suitcase wheels. We approached the security checkpoint. The line was a massive serpentine queue of travelers, corralled by black nylon straps. Julian's eyes were darting around, analyzing the security setup. Cleveland Hopkins used the high-definition computed tomography (CT) scanners, the state-of-the-art machines that produce highly detailed 3D images of a bag's contents. He knew this. He had researched it. He knew that the thick silver lead foil tape he had wrapped around the package would show up on those scanners as a solid, impenetrable black mason, immediate red flag for any TSA agent. He positioned us in the line. He made sure Janelle went first, then himself, and then me. We'll go through this lane, Mira, he whispered, guiding me by the elbow toward the left side queue. It looks like it's moving faster. I let him guide me. I let him think he was the master puppeteer, pulling the strings of my life. I watched the back of Janelle's cream cashmere coat, and then I looked down at the pink spinner bag she was wheeling, so effortlessly beside her. Deep inside that pink bag, wedged tightly against the aluminum handle tubes, was the 3-pound package of stolen bearer bonds and high-grade narcotics. I looked at my watch. It was 7:15 a.m. Right now, my sister Claire was driving her old station wagon toward downtown Cleveland. In less than 2 hours, she would walk into the FBI office on Lakeside Avenue and hand over the manila folder containing the digital audit trail, the forged signatures, and the incorporation documents for J&J Horizon Holdings. The trap was set. The tracks had been redirected. As we shuffled closer to the gray plastic bins of the security checkpoint, the tension in the air became thick enough to taste. Julian was sweating now, a thin sheen of perspiration glistening on his forehead despite the cool draft of the terminal. He kept looking back at me, his eyes wide and anxious, waiting for the moment my green bag would reach the scanner. He was waiting for my destruction. I looked straight ahead, my hands clasped loosely in front of me, a small, quiet smile playing on my lips. The TSA agent at the front of the line pointed a gloved finger at Janelle. Next, please place all bags, electronics, and light jackets into the bins. Janelle stepped forward, her pink suitcase rolling smoothly behind her, completely unaware that she was wheeling a bomb right into the center of her own life. The conveyor belt of the security lane moved with a heavy, mechanical groan, a sound that felt like the gears of a trap slowly grinding into place. I stood exactly where Julian had positioned me, 1 step behind him, 2 steps behind Janelle. The air under the fluorescent lights of the checkpoint was thick with the scent of ozone, cheap floor cleaner, and the nervous sweat of hundreds of people trying to prove their innocence to a machine. To my left, a toddler was crying, a high, thin sound that scraped against my nerves. I didn't look at the child. I kept my eyes locked on the back of Janelle's cream-colored cashmere coat. She lifted her pink spinner suitcase onto the stainless steel rollers. She did it with a theatrical little sigh, brushing a stray lock of blonde hair from her forehead as if the physical exertion of lifting 20 pounds of plastic was a personal insult. "Do I really need to take my boots off?" she asked the TSA officer, her voice carrying that sharp, spoiled edge she usually reserved for the waitstaff at the local country club. "They're Italian leather. They don't have any metal in them." "Boots off, ma'am, in the bin," the officer replied, his voice flat, exhausted, and entirely unimpressed by her pedigree. Janelle scoffed, stepping back to unzip her boots. Behind her, Julian stepped up to the line. He was watching her, but his hands were twitching. He kept reaching down to touch the handle of my forest green canvas suitcase, which was sitting in a gray plastic bin on the rollers, waiting its turn. He was so eager to see that green bag slide into the dark mouth of the X-ray machine. He was holding his breath, his eyes wide, waiting for the moment his 26 years of marriage would be officially erased by a federal security alert. I know some of you reading this might have wanted me to scream at him right there. You might have wanted me to grab him by his expensive merino wool collar, in front of all these strangers, and yell the truth of what he had done to me. But if you've ever had to sit through a closing where you knew the seller was trying to hide a massive foundation crack under a fresh coat of paint, you know that the loudest voice never wins. You don't interrupt a liar while they are in the middle of executing their own ruin. You just stand back, keep your hands folded, and let the law of gravity do the heavy lifting. Sir, step forward, the officer told Julian. Julian blinked, pulled out of his trance. Right? Yes, of course. He placed his sleek black Toomey bag on the belt. Then, with a lingering, almost tender touch, he pushed my green suitcase forward. He looked back at me, a tight artificial smile stretching across his face. Just put your purse in the bin, Mira, he said, his voice dropping into that soft, patronizing register he used when he wanted to make me feel small. Don't worry, I've got the heavy bags. Just walk through when they tell you. I'm not worried, Julian, I said, my voice as steady as a ledger line. I have nothing to hide. Janelle's pink suitcase entered the high-definition CT scanner. I watched the TSA operator sitting behind the glass shield. He was a middle-aged man with a graying mustache. His eyes half closed as he watched the digital, three-dimensional images of shoes, hairdryers, and toiletries scroll across his screen. It was a monotonous job, the kind of repetitive labor Julian always looked down on. But then, the operator's posture changed. He didn't just look at the screen. He leaned forward, his nose nearly touching the glass. He tapped the monitor with his index finger. He clicked a button on his console, reversing the conveyor belt. Janelle's pink bag slid backward out of the scanner, then forward again. On the high-resolution 3D screen, which was partially visible from where I stood, a solid, impenetrable black rectangle appeared near the bottom of the pink bag, wedged tightly against the aluminum telescoping handles. It was a perfect, dense mass of lead foil tepa, beacon of absolute guilt in a world of transparent plastic. The operator stood up. He didn't raise his voice, but his hand moved instantly to his radio. We have a code orange at lane 4. Supervisor, to lane 4 immediately. The mechanical hum of the conveyor belt stopped. Janelle, who was currently balancing on one foot while trying to slide her second Italian leather boot back on, looked up, her face twisting into an expression of pure annoyance. Excuse me, is there a problem? My bag went through. Why did the belt stop? Ma'am, step away from the bin, the TSA officer at the end of the line said, his voice dropping into a low, authoritative register that immediately drew the attention of the travelers in the adjacent lanes. Julian stepped forward, his professional negotiator persona clicking into place like a reflex. Officer, I'm sure there's just been a misunderstanding. I'm Julian Vance, managing partner of Vance Commercial Realty. This is my executive assistant. We're on our way to a major international summit in Zurich. Sir, step back, the officer repeated, his hand resting near his utility belt. Ma'am, is this your bag? He pointed to the bubblegum pink spinner. Yes, it's mine, Janelle snapped, crossing her arms over her cream coat. And it is full of designer clothing that cost more than your car. I suggest you handle it with care. A female supervisor with a clipboard and 2 armed police officers appeared from the side corridor. The air in the checkpoint suddenly felt cold. The kind of stillness that settles over a room right before a judge reads a verdict. We need to conduct a physical inspection of this bag, the supervisor said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. She hoisted the pink suitcase onto a heavy stainless steel table at the side of the checkpoint. Julian's eyes were darting back and forth between the pink suitcase and my green bag, which was still sitting completely untouched on the rollers. I could see the frantic, chaotic math happening inside his head. He knew the package was wrapped in lead foil. He knew the scanner had flagged it. But his brain was short-circuiting because the package was supposed to be an my asterisk bag. He had put it there himself. He had watched the glue dry. He looked at me, his face pale, a sudden, frantic desperation in his eyes. Mira, did you touch my bags last night? He whispered, his voice shaking so hard his teeth clicked. Why would I touch your bags, Julian? I asked, looking him straight in the eyes. You said you wanted to handle all the heavy lifting. I just let you. Open the bag, please, the supervisor told Janelle. Janelle marched over to the table, her boot heels clicking sharply against the tile. This is harassment. I am going to file a formal complaint. Julian, call our lawyers. This is ridiculous. She snatched her keys from her purse and unlocked the small TSA-approved lock on her zipper. The supervisor unzipped the pink shell. She opened it like a book. Inside were Janelle's pastel silk blouses, her lace undergarments, and her expensive cosmetics, all packed neatly in separate mesh cubes. The supervisor began removing the items, laying them out on the stainless steel table. Janelle looked like she was about to explode with rage. There is nothing in there, she screamed. It's just my clothes. But the supervisor wasn't looking at the clothes. She reached into the very bottom of the pink suitcase. Her fingers felt the stiff, uneven lump along the center seam of the lining. She looked down and saw the backward zipper, the one without the pull tab. She pulled a small silver pen from her pocket, slid the tip into the metal eyelet, and pulled it back. With a soft, metallic scrape, the lining parted. The supervisor reached her gloved hand into the hollow space between the fabric and the outer plastic shell. She pulled the heavy vacuum-sealed black pouch, wrapped tightly in silver lead foil tape, slid out onto the metal table. It made a solid, heavy thud as it landed on the steel surface. Julian let out a tiny, pathetic whimper that sounded like a dog being kicked in the ribs. He took a step back, his hand flying to his mouth. His skin had turned a sickening shade of gray, the color of wet concrete. What is that? Janelle shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that made several people in the security line cover their ears. That's not mine. I've never seen that in my life. Julian, what is that? Tell them, it's not mine. Ma'am, keep your hands where we can see them, one of the armed police officers said, stepping between Janelle and the table. It's a mistake, Janelle cried, her face flushing a deep, ugly red, all her polished, youthful poise evaporating in an instant. She looked like a terrified child. Julian, do something. You packed the bags. You put them in the car. Julian didn't answer her. He couldn't. He was staring at the silver-wrapped package as if it were a venomous snake that had just crawled out of his own pocket. He looked at the package, and then slowly, with a horror so deep it seemed to age him 10 years and 10 seconds, he looked at me. I didn't blink. I didn't turn away. I stood there in my sensible orthopedic shoes, my worn microfiber purse slung over my shoulder, and I let him see me. Really see me. For 26 years, he had looked right through me, treating me like the drywall that held up his life invisible, quiet, and easily replaced. But now, he was looking at the woman who had spent 30 years finding the things people tried to bury in the margins of 60-page contracts. You should have checked the signatures, Julian, I said, my voice barely louder than a whisper. But in the sudden silence of the checkpoint, it carried like a bell. I always put a dot in the loop of the Y. Before he could even process the words, 2 men in dark, well-tailored suits stepped out of the crowd, bypassing the security ropes. They didn't look like airport police. They had the heavy, humorless bearing of federal agents. One of them was holding a manila folder with a metal claspia, exact folder my sister Claire had carried into the federal building on Lakeside Avenue just 2 hours earlier. The agent looked at Julian, then at Janelle, and finally at me. He gave me a brief, respectful nod. Julian Vance, Janelle Miller. The agent asked, pulling a leather badge wallet from his breast pocket. I'm Special Agent Vance with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant for your arrest regarding the ongoing investigation into escrow, fraud, and interstate transport of stolen securities. Julian's knees buckled. If the police officer hadn't grabbed him by the arm, he would have collapsed right there on the cold, salt-stained tile of the Cleveland airport. And as the federal agents clicked the cold, steel handcuffs around his wrists, the man who had spent 26 years trying to make me feel invisible finally realized that some women are quiet not because they have nothing to say, but because they are busy writing the ending. The silence that followed the click of those handcuffs was the loudest sound I have ever heard in my 52 years. For a few seconds, the entire security checkpoint seemed to hold its breath. The travelers behind us stood frozen, their gray plastic bins clutched against their chests like shields. The TSA officers stood like statues. And there, in the middle of it all, was Julian. His hands were secured behind his back. His expensive merino wool quarter zip pulled tight across his shoulders, making him look smaller, older, and suddenly very fragile. Janelle was weeping now, a loud, ugly, hysterical sound that had none of her usual practiced elegance. She kept twisting her wrists, trying to pull away from the female officer who was guiding her toward the exit. "It's not mine," she kept screaming, her voice echoing off the high steel rafters of the terminal. "He put it in there. Julian, tell them. Tell them you packed my bag." But Julian didn't say a word. He couldn't. He looked at me, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide with a desperate, silent pleading. He wanted me to say something. He wanted me to step forward, to play the role of the loyal, quiet wife, who would somehow smooth this over, who would tell the federal agents that it was all a terrible mistake. He wanted the woman who had spent 26 years mending his shirts and packing his lunches to save him from the fire he had lit with his own hands. I didn't say a word. I just reached down, picked up my green canvas suitcase from the gray bin, and zipped it closed. The fabric cement I had used to repair the lining held perfectly. The bag felt light in my handlight, because it was no longer carrying the weight of his betrayal. "Mrs. Vance," Special Agent Vance said, his voice quiet and professional as he stepped beside me. "We have a transport vehicle waiting downstairs for your husband and Ms. Miller. My colleagues will need you to come down to our office on Lakeside Avenue later this afternoon to sign the formal affidavits and review the forged escrow documents. Can you make it by 2 o'clock? "I'll be there, Agent Vance," I said, adjusting the strap of my sensible microfiber purse. "I have the original ledger files and the signature comparison sheets ready." He gave me a small, respectful nod, the kind of nod one professional gives another when a difficult transaction has finally cleared. "Thank you for your cooperation. I know this isn't how you envisioned your trip." "Actually," I said, looking at Julian one last time as the officers began to lead him away, "it's exactly how I hoped it would end." I walked out of the terminal alone. The cold spring air of Cleveland hit my face like a splash of clean water. The heavy, gray fog was beginning to lift, revealing a pale, watery blue sky over the highway. I walked past the line of idling cars, past the busy travelers rushing to make their flights, and made my way to the outer parking lot where Claire was waiting. She was sitting in her old station wagon, the engine idling with a familiar, comforting rattle. The moment she saw me walking toward her, she threw open the driver's side door and ran to meet me. She didn't ask any questions. She just wrapped her arms around me, her thick green knitted cardigan, smelling of lavender detergent and old library books. We stood there on the damp asphalt of the parking lot, holding on to each other while the world kept moving all around us. "It's done, Claire," I whispered into her shoulder. "It's over." She pulled back, her eyes red but her face bright with a fierce, proud smile. "Let's go home, Mira. I've got the kettle ready." If you've ever had to drive away from the wreckage of your own life, then you know that the first few miles are the hardest. You don't feel victorious. You don't feel like celebrating. You just feel a deep, hollow ache in the center of your chest, a quiet realization that the landscape of your existence has been permanently altered. I know some of you are driving that road right now. You've finally stood up. You've finally set that hard boundary. And now you're sitting in the quiet of your car, wondering how you're going to rebuild the house they tore down. I want you to look at the road ahead of you. The pavement might be cracked, and the sky might be gray, but the wheel is in your hands now. Take a deep breath. You are stronger than the storm they sent to destroy you. The next 3 weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork, meetings, and quiet revelations. Because of my 30 years of experience as an escrow compliance officer, the federal prosecutors and the Ohio Department of Insurance treated me not as a suspect's wife, but as their primary expert witness. I spent hours in a windowless conference room in the federal building downtown, sitting at a long table covered in high-gloss manila folders. I helped them untangle the web of digital transactions Julian had used to siphon the $4.2 million from the West Side Retail Development escrow account. I showed them exactly how he had routed the funds through 3 different shell companies before depositing them into the J&J Horizon Holdings account in Zurich. Every time they showed me a document with my forged signature, I pointed to the missing dot in the loop of the Y. "It's a beautiful forgery," the assistant district attorney remarked, shaking his head as he looked at a quarterly compliance audit. "If you hadn't told us about the security dot, our forensic document examiners might have taken weeks to verify the fraud." Julian always focused on the big picture, I explained, my voice calm and measured. He never had the patience for the margins. But in my line of work, the margins are where the truth lives. Because of my cooperation and the meticulous evidence I provided, the state licensing board was able to freeze the Swiss accounts before Julian's offshore bank could process the final wire transfers. Every single penny of the $4.2 million was returned to the escrow trust accounts, saving dozens of local, small business investors from absolute financial ruin. The local bakery owner, the retired contractor who had invested his life savings into the retail development, the young couple trying to open their first pharmacy, they all got their money back. Buckeye State Title Corporate Headquarters sent a formal letter of commendation to my office, along with a modest bonus for exemplary corporate stewardship and risk mitigation. I didn't use the money to buy luxury items. I used it to pay off the remaining balance on my mortgage, ensuring that the roof over my head belonged entirely to me. Julian's brokerage firm went into immediate receivership. His office in the Westlake Commercial Park was cleared out. The sleek glass desks and leather chairs sold off at a public auction to pay his outstanding corporate debts. Janelle's pastel pink spinner suitcase remained in federal evidence for a long time. Her defense attorney tried to argue that she had no knowledge of the narcotics or the stolen bearer bonds, claiming she was merely an employee following her supervisor's instructions. But the J&J Horizon Holdings Incorporation documents, which bore her neat, stylized signature alongside Julian's, told a different story. She eventually agreed to a plea deal, pleading guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence of 18 months in a minimum security federal facility. Julian's fate was much heavier. Faced with overwhelming evidence of escrow fraud, grand larceny, forgery, and interstate transport of controlled substances, his high-priced defense team quickly realized that a trial would be a disaster. He pleaded guilty to all charges. The judge, noting the calculated cruelty of his attempt to frame his wife of 26 years, sentenced him to 8 years at the Federal Correctional Institution in Elkton, Ohio. 2 days before he was scheduled to be transported to the facility, his attorney called me. "Mrs. Vance," the lawyer said, his voice hesitant, "your husband has requested a brief visitation. He wants to discuss the terms of the divorce settlement. He asked me to tell you that he is deeply sorry." I sat at my worn kitchen table, holding a blue and white ceramic mug of chamomile tea. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the window, highlighting the faded spots on the linoleum floor where Julian's heavy boots used to tread. "I won't be coming to the jail," I said, my voice steady and quiet. "But you can tell him that I have already filed the divorce petition. I am not asking for alimony, and I am not asking for his share of the brokerage's remaining personal accounts. I only want the house, my pension, and my grandmother's silver sewing needle." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Vance, you are legally entitled to much more than that. With the assets we've managed to shield from the receivership, you could easily claim his entire personal retirement fund." "I don't want his money," I said, looking out the window at the small, green tomato plants I had planted in the backyard. "I spent 26 years building a life with him, and I learned that everything he touched carried a price. I want to build a life that is entirely free of his debts. I am leaving him enough to pay his legal fees and keep his dignity, because taking everything would have made me like him. And I am nothing like him." I hung up the phone. I walked out to my back porch, the screen door letting out a familiar, rusty creak behind me. The air was warm and sweet with the smell of damp earth and blooming lilacs. Claire was sitting on the wooden steps, her fingers busy knitting a yellow baby blanket for one of her library colleagues. She looked up at me, her eyes soft and knowing. "Did you talk to him?" she asked. "No," I said, sitting down beside her and letting my shoulder rest against hers. "I talked to his lawyer. It's done. The house is mine, and the past is his." She smiled, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "How does it feel?" I looked out at my quiet backyard, at the sturdy wooden fence my father had helped me build years ago, at the simple, beautiful life I had fought so hard to protect. I didn't feel a rush of wild joy or a sense of vindictive triumph. I just felt a deep, settled warmth, the kind of peace that comes when you finally realize that your worth was never defined by the person who tried to discard you. "It feels quiet, Claire," I said, taking a deep, clean breath of the Ohio air. "And for the first time in 26 years, that is exactly what I want. I know some of you are waiting for the noise to stop. You're waiting for the shouting, the anger, and the betrayal to fade so you can finally hear your own voice again. I want you to know that the quiet is coming. It won't come from a courtroom, and it won't come from their apology. It will come from the simple, daily choices you make to honor your own dignity. It will come when you realize that your life is not a transaction to be negotiated, and your heart is not a liability to be managed. Love is a gift, not a line item in a budget. And when someone treats you like a cost they can no longer afford, you don't argue the math. You just close the ledger, Walk away from the table, and let them find out exactly how much it costs to live without you.